Welcome, everyone. We're so thrilled that you're able to join us today for what we hope will be an engaging conversation on collaboration. And thank you to the Forum for dedicating this year's conference to one of the most critical issues of our time. Over the past few days, we've heard from a number of leading experts on the gravity of the climate crisis. However, it bears repeating that time is paramount and that each of us must reflect on how we can come together to work towards solutions. Philanthropy must continue to adapt and coordinate efforts, align funding, and enable informed decision-making across stakeholders. Funders who partner together are able to scale impact far beyond what their own individual actions can produce. Collaboration provides a number of benefits to donors in the field. It provides knowledge and expertise. It sources and monitors partnerships with local stakeholders. It mobilizes more resources than any one individual funder can do alone, and it connects funders to like-minded peers. Today, we're excited to explore a number of topics as a group, including effective partnerships in climate and pathways to engage, the benefit to funders and value to the field of using intermediaries to drive impact, and an exploration of what makes a collaborative successful and how to measure impact and success. Now that I've set the stage for the conversation, let's welcome our panelists. Today, I'm excited to welcome three esteemed experts: Doug Griffiths, president of the Oak Foundation; Jennifer Kitt, founding president of the Climate Leadership Initiative; and Charlotte Para, president and CEO of the ClimateWorks Foundation. Thank you all for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Thanks.
Great. Well, I'm thrilled that we're all able to have this conversation. I thought that we would start out with some brief introductions. And Charlotte, perhaps we can start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick. And I'm really delighted to be here and to be on this panel with you and Doug and Jen. Just a few words about the ClimateWorks Foundation. We are on a mission to end the climate crisis by amplifying the power of philanthropy. We work with partners to shape and scale big climate solutions, and we offer philanthropist programs and services to help them build and execute their own climate strategies. We take a global approach. For example, our programs target global transformations that are necessary to meet the Paris climate goals, like decarbonizing the industrial sector, protecting forests, aligning public and private finance with climate goals, and so forth. Our services include providing global intelligence, supporting collaborations, and grant making. Since we were founded in 2008, we have awarded well over $1 billion to more than 500 grantees working around the world. And just one more point to the theme of this conference, we design all of our programs and services to support and encourage collaboration among funders and further among funders, grantees, and other leaders and experts. So that's us.
Great. Thanks, Charlotte. Jennifer.
Thanks, Charlotte and Nick. My name is Jennifer Kitt. I'm coming to you today from the San Francisco Bay Area. Charlotte and I are both there, actually, and we're happy to report that the sky is more clear now. I lead the Climate Leadership Initiative, which is one of those collaboratives that Charlotte was mentioning. Our role is to help donors learn about climate and scale their giving. We don't charge for that, and we don't pool funds or fundraise in any way, so we kind of we're freed to serve the donors and to connect them to high impact climate mitigation solutions as quickly as possible for funding. So collaboration is one of the things that we teach to new funders, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of the philanthropists on the phone today.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Doug.
Well, great. Thanks, Nick, and good evening from Geneva, Switzerland. So I'm the president of Oak Foundation, and Oak is a family-led foundation with its headquarters here in Geneva, but we have offices in North Carolina and London, and then country programs in Zimbabwe, Denmark, India, and Brazil. We commit our resources to address issues of global, social, and environmental concerns, particularly those that have a major impact on the lives of the disadvantaged. And we do about $300 million a year in grant making across a wide variety of programs in that area. Our climate strategy is to protect clean air, build healthy, resilient communities, and create jobs in the clean energy sector. Emerging work revolves around the use of coal as the biggest source of climate pollution, plastics, the global food supply chain, climate justice, and supporting campaigns and movements. And we love to collaborate, and I'm very fortunate to have rich collaboration with both Charlotte and Jennifer, so it's exciting to be here tonight.
Great. Well, again, thank you all for joining us. And I would also mention to the audience that we welcome any questions along the way. We've got some pre-prepared, but please feel free to submit your questions and we will read them out. I would like to start with the core of this discussion, collaboration. And Charlotte, can you speak about why collaboration is important in climate?
Yeah, so it's so important. As I think we all know, climate change is arguably the greatest challenge that humanity faces. It's ultimately an existential threat, but more immediately, if we fail to meet this challenge, the amount of suffering we are going to see in the years and decades ahead, and that we're seeing now every day in the news, is really staggering. It's horrifying. We have to solve this problem, and we can, but tackling climate change is not simple. We need to literally transform the global economy. The world needs to spend trillions of capital on solutions. We need to transform entire sectors, electricity, transportation, industry. We will need to remove massive amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere through natural solutions like planting trees or better agricultural practices, through technical solutions. We need to do all of this and more. And we can. There are plenty of studies that show that we can, but these are big tasks. And that means that collaboration is really crucial in and across philanthropy, civil society, governments, the private sector, in and across regions and countries if we are going to succeed. Fortunately, climate funders recognized this early on and created and support organizations like ClimateWorks, like CLI that Jen leads, to help funders engage and connect, work together on climate, and make the most of their combined intellectual and financial resources. And that is why philanthropy is making a very real difference in this big and complex challenge. And I just have to note, and I'm sorry to embarrass you, Doug, but the Oak Foundation really has been an extraordinary leader for many years in driving collaboration in philanthropy and climate and in other areas as well.
It's a great point, and I'd love to actually move to Doug to explore the perspective of the funder. So Doug, what inspires the Oak Foundation to collaborate, and what are some of the lessons that you've learned along the way?
Well, I think, especially in the climate phase, as Charlotte pointed out, the challenge is just absolutely enormous, and it's beyond the scope of anything any individual can do, which is why we work through the ClimateWorks and the Climate Leadership Foundation, or initiative, sorry. The only way to advance climate action is really through purposeful collaboration, and we collaborate to amplify and accelerate our goals, and it's been a very successful approach for us. Working alongside others is really the core of Oak's approach on climate. And I'd like to share 4 lessons that we have, which is what we wanted to share on why we collaborate and what we've learned from it. And the first is focus on big picture goals and flexibility on how to get there. Collaboration means you can't be too rigid in how you interpret strategies. Too many funders get bogged down in the details of their own individual organization's way of doing things, and in the end find it easier to go alone. But climate in particular is an area where we really need to rally together. We need to collaborate radically and target specifically. And that means we can't afford to get weighed down in the details. That was really the key to the success of the Plastics Initiative. And it's something we're trying to replicate with our Healthy Diet, Healthy Planet initiative that ClimateWorks, among others, are helping us work on, where we hope to get vegans on the same bus as locavores, in the hope that, by working together without, focusing on too many details, and with great humility, we can make progress. The second one is to use your networks to avoid reinventing the wheel. Whenever we're exploring a new area, we approach our contacts and our partners who are already in the field. And that's the key to learning things. I was in government for over 30 years, and I was always struck by vanity projects of new administrations or new leaders. And I was pretty disappointed that you see the same thing in philanthropy. And I think, once again, humility goes a long way. and I think the example there would be with, we were early funders of the European Climate Foundation, where our united voices have really played an amazing role in mobilizing $1 trillion in commitments for the Green Deal, which will be the largest public investment in European history. And the aim is to cut emissions by 55% by 2030, which is really quite extraordinary. The third lesson for us is build in learning and information sharing in collaborations from the beginning. And that's related to my point earlier. Someone might have a better strategy. Some new entrant might have a new idea. We need to be open to that. We need to learn from it. We need to pivot. And I think the best example for that is one that probably you're all thinking right now, is when the climate movement was electrified by these young activists who came at this with passion and commitment. And so we're trying to apply those learnings as well through the Urban Movement Innovation Fund. It's a pooled fund that focuses on cities as a venue for accelerated climate action and supports local movements to unstick politics that I think around the world on the climate have not made as much progress as we might have hoped. The last one, I'm going to have a negative lesson here too, which is bring partners to the table early to co-create. That's been really successful for us with our work to get coal out of Southeast Asia. And working with local community campaigns, we've helped cancel 180 new coal plants, which is really extraordinary. Alas, there have been cases where we've been less successful. And the one that comes to mind is one that was filled with great intention from Oak Foundation, which is, we acknowledge that we were really focusing on global solutions and policy and mitigation, whereas much of our foundation is really focused on supporting vulnerable populations. So it made sense for us to become the founding funders for the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, which is a collaborative dedicated to help communities hit by climate change, in particular women, indigenous groups, and youth, who have been really left out of the climate conversation often. However, despite solid grant making, the fund failed to attract much co-funding, largely because we didn't do the collaborative work up front. So hopefully, with great humility and great collaboration, we can work together to chart a new path for climate justice, because I think there's just a lot of interest in that field right now of trying to bring just transition and climate justice work to drive grassroots efforts. So those are 4 lessons learned for us.
Those are great lessons, and I'd actually love to hear a little bit more about the evolution of the Oak Foundation's approach. Is collaboration something that was always at the core of the work that you did? Did you come to it after trying to identify solutions by way of individual grantees and recognizing the need for collaboration?
Well, I think it's baked into our DNA. It's how our family likes to work, especially Christian Parker, who's the lead trustee for climate. That's just the way his brain works. He wants to know what other people are doing. He's really, I think, cognizant that other people have great ideas, and that through complementarity, you can really work better. And I will admit that there's a real utilitarian reason for us to collaborate so much. And that's because the family has decided that to really be true to its family foundation, they're limiting the number of employees we can have. And we have a budget of 300 million and a limit of fewer than 100 employees and great ambition across the foundation. You've really got a task to collaborate. So I would love to have more inspirational words for people, but I think for us, it's not only part of our nature, but it's also part of necessity.
Yeah, it's a brilliant point to emphasize here, right? The use of using intermediaries as sourcing opportunities, right? And to maximize impact. Jen, I'd love to bring you into the conversation for any additional reflections. What do you see that inspires funders to collaborate? And what are some of the lessons that you've seen across your experience?
Well, maybe I'll just build on what Doug said. The Oak Foundation and others actually created regional climate foundations like the European Climate Foundation that you just heard about, and others so that the capacity could be shared, right? So that's something really important for new funders to know, that there are organizations that are actually scaled up, sophisticated program teams in particular places that are important to climate, that the early funders recognized were going to be necessary, but not just for themselves. They built it for all of the funders who came after to use. And that's an example of collaboration to build capacity that now is available. And you hear it even in some of Doug's examples about project collaboration, right? We have collaboration to know how these sophisticated funders want to give now because they're sharing information, much of it provided by Charlotte's organization. And knowing, okay, you've got this region, I can think about this one, but you've also got project-based things like the Urban Movement Innovation Fund, where they're seeking there to connect the technical sector decarbonization strategies that Charlotte was talking about, right? You've got to decarbonize transportation, very complex, intricate strategy, but you've got to also have people who vote and people who want it on the ground putting the kinds of pressure on that gets that change to happen from that side too. How do you join up those strategies when there's such different organizations working on them? That was an issue that the team at Oak and others saw, workshopped it with a group, and then came up with this idea, got a great leader, and it's now a pooled fund ready to scale. There are other examples like that. It's good to know how it's done and that it's easy to collaborate even if you're new.
Great. Any other reflections that you see that bring donors to the table to collaboratives?
From my perspective, CLI generally works with folks who are new to climate, and most of the time they want to know what their peers are doing and why, and they need a simple way to see that, because if they start to kind of meet with Christian Parker, meet with Chris Hahn, meet with Jeremy and Hani Grantham, it takes them a very long time to rationalize all these ideas. So part of what we do is actually try and isolate for them. This is what the climate community is doing, who's funding. This is why. These are the big bets. These are the areas that nobody's in because there's not enough philanthropy yet actually in this space. And then generally first investments tend to be like, okay, let's go along with an organization we trust or a person we trust in a particular strategy, or we're very interested in this geography, and so show us how to collaborate in that space. Most of the time people start that way, and over time they learn how to give impactfully.
Great. So it's very much an emergent learning strategy. Brilliant. I'd like to stay with you, Jen, and to talk about some of the hesitations that you hear and how to move beyond them and how to activate as a donor. We know that many philanthropists are inspired to act, but many are uncertain how to do so. So what are some of those hesitations that you hear, and what would you say for donors that are considering collaboration and how they might activate?
I think many of the obstacles I've noticed in sort of the first 15, 16 months of the Climate Leadership Initiative are really around the complexity Charlotte mentioned. Solving climate is quite complicated. There are many important levers that have to be turned in any one of these areas. So at its basis, you have to stop emissions. So that's already hard, because think of all the places that we're relying on fossil fuels that have to be transitioned in a kind of just and equitable way. You have to protect and preserve nature, which is serving this like miraculous function of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And then all of our models also say that you have to scale up some version of carbon removal. So those are the three big categories of what has to be done. But the intricacy of how you do it and what strategies are right for philanthropy can feel overwhelming and a learning curve. What I usually advise, and what all of us at CLI advise, is have a bit of a framework so that you understand those three big areas of what has to happen in the world, and then start to narrow in on what's most interesting to you and find collaborators. And that could be strategies, that could be organizations that you trust. But get in there quickly, because there's such urgency with this problem that learning while doing is actually the way to go, and scale as quickly as possible. Because given the fact that climate philanthropy is less than 2% of global philanthropy, there's lots of room for new entrants. So the obstacle is usually complexity, and having a framework and having some peers to learn with and do with usually is the way to get past that barrier.
So I'd love to also touch on another hesitation that we often hear from giving families
I
around.
can't hear you anymore. Can everyone hear Nick?
It was quite low.
Oh,
Quiet.
Okay.
can you
So
guys
I'll
hear me
fix
now?
my audio.
Yes.
Great. Sorry about that. I would love to bring in an issue that we generally hear that is a hesitation for families, and that is the issue of control. And Doug, maybe you can speak to this. How does the Oak Foundation think about the issue of control when you're part of a collective? Is that a concern that you are in part losing yourself in the collective?
So now you've got a bit of, well, now I've got an echo. Charlotte, do you? Okay, there we go. Excellent.
Perfect.
I think that is perhaps a risk of collaboration. But I think especially in the climate phase, as both Jennifer and Charlotte, the urgency is such that we all need to get over that. I need to find ways that you will, as I said earlier, one of the lessons is, the first one was you're not going to get everything you want necessarily. And we've had a lot of, I think, internal debate and actually a lot of internal laughter as we look at the learnings from the plastic campaign, that there were things of that where the interests of the trash pickers in India were not necessarily aligned with a consumer at my local grocery store who will only purchase in bulk. And you've just got to find ways to accommodate that. And I started by the laughter is on the healthy diets campaign, because even within our family, there's everything. And so you've got to find a way of, look, we all acknowledge that in order to be sustainable, we've got to find better ways to produce our food and different ways to consume it. And we have very purposely at Oak focused on Europe, because we feel that culturally this is more relevant to us. We understand it. We don't risk running afoul of various things. So you are going to lose some of your control when you collaborate. And I really can't think of an example at Oak where that has been meaningful. If I can just give one little example, we had with the Global Commons, which is getting off the ground to figure out what the carrying capacity of planet Earth is. There was the intermediary came to us and said they provide annual reporting. And they said, would you like us to do this quarterly? And I think many of us went, "Ooh, that would be great," but that is just such a burden on not only them but all of the grantees down the line. And we said, no, let's continue with annual reporting. And so sometimes we have to take a deep cleansing breath, which I think is a good characteristic for life in general, but especially for collaboratives, and think about what's going to get us to our destination.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I would also share for the audience is think about the governance model of the collaboration, right? Think about what is being asked of you and where there's opportunities to participate, and be proactive about that. And I hear what you're saying, Doug, around the need to outweigh the benefits from the risk, right? So that's important. Charlotte, I'd love to bring you back into the conversation to highlight collaboration in action and share an example of what you've seen.
Happy to. Lots of examples that one could share, many of which have come up already. Doug and Jen have raised some really good examples. Here's one. One of our major initiatives focuses on electric vehicles. It's essentially about reducing greenhouse gas emissions from road transport, so cars, trucks, buses, etc., to near zero by mid-century, largely by making sure that in the next 5 years, we get to a market tipping point where electric vehicles just outcompete combustion vehicles and rapidly take over the global market. Lots of reasons to believe this is possible, and we do. It's also not inevitable, and philanthropy really has an important role to play here. Fortunately, this is an area where philanthropy has been active and collaborative for many years, so we have a lot to work with. So for example, about 4 years ago, we launched a global coalition of allies working to advance electric vehicles. That coalition has now grown to more than 50 organizations, environmental organizations, health organizations, and foundations, and others working together in this space. There are also about a dozen foundations now that are funding this work. Together, we aligned about $45 million for this work in 2020. That's not enough. As Jen knows well, this number needs to increase at least fourfold in short order, but it's a big improvement on past years. So why does this kind of collaboration matter? Let me just give one really specific example that's very recent. Back in June, just a few months ago, California adopted a first in the world rule to require manufacturers to transition to electric trucks, and that's trucks of all sizes, starting in 2024. That was a very big deal. Some months before, a number of funders, including ClimateWorks, who were already collaborating, were already aligned on strategy, quickly aligned resources to support a group of about 20 organizations, environmental justice organizations, health groups, business groups, labor, community groups, to come together and press for a strong rule. And they were successful, which is really exciting. As soon as California had adopted that rule, then the larger global coalition began to work right away to urge other US states, other countries to adopt similar rules. This is obviously still playing out. It's very new, but we are optimistic, and it's a good example of the power of collaboration and ongoing collaboration to drive change on the scale that we need.
Fantastic, really helpful. And a number of questions are coming in, so I'll pause in a moment to ask some of them, but please continue to send them in. Before we do that, Jennifer, I want to talk about success. So can you talk about what makes a collaborative successful?
Yeah, I think I'm going to do what I did before and actually just pick one of the examples you've heard and unpack it for learning. So the transportation, the road transportation example you just heard is a marvelous example of a group of nonprofits collaborating. Actually, more than 70 of them have constructed this fantastic strategy to flip passenger vehicles and more complicated freight trucks from emissions, right? One of the sectors we have to move off of, from the polluting tailpipe to electric within a 5-year period with a very nuanced set of strategies. And they've picked 4 regions to focus on because it's a global market. And if you flip those 4 regions, you can flip everything ultimately. It's super exciting. But the thing is, like, you can collaborate as a philanthropist because the NGOs came together with lots of good work by ClimateWorks and others and created that strategy. They can explain it. They can show early wins. They've actually raised the first $45 million towards it. Makes it very easy for a new philanthropist to be part of that and learn along the way, but also to have a really big impact. Not every area has that, right? That one's ready. There are areas where there's almost no philanthropy at all. And so the people who launch that and start early are actually willing to start something brand new, like in carbon removal or in decarbonizing concrete and steel and scaling that. Things like that would be much earlier stages. So just unpacking that, you can see how special it is when you've got a strategy that you're ready to collaborate on, when it's ready for funding. I wanted to share that.
That's a really helpful example. We're getting a question from the audience. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Are you all hearing that?
Keep going. It's better now.
Yeah.
Perfect. These are the challenges of virtual learning, right? One of the audience members asked a question that is very timely and topical, focused on equity. And they're asking, how do collaboratives center the communities at the front lines of climate change? And I will throw that out to the 3 of you and see who wants to take that.
Can I start, and then you guys can provide more expertise? So I think that's why we jumped into the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, and it was actually part of a discussion of a major grant that we were giving to the ClimateWorks Foundation. And the family just, as I said earlier, they recognized that there was significant work in the climate field from us. There was an earlier question on mitigation and adaptation. on mitigation. And most of the work we do is housing and homelessness and preventing child sexual abuse and issues affecting women and human rights across the foundation really is focused on grassroots organizations and building those. So our climate work was a bit of an outlier for good cause, right? Because if we don't have huge policy changes and huge shifts, we're not going to have a significant impact on the climate. So the idea for Climate Justice Resilience Fund was to bring more of that grassroots effort to look at the equity piece, which is extraordinarily complicated in this world that we all see. We're really working in we're working in the Arctic, we're working in the Sundarbans of West Bengal and Bangladesh, and the highlands of Africa. And look, we see climate change everywhere, but the idea is just to try to empower grassroots organizations to look for solutions to the climate challenges they're facing. And I think it's similar to the other things. It's a minor amounts of money, but we hope that there can be some catalytic change with that.
And I guess I would ask a follow-up question here, which is, what is the feedback loop, the listening loop that is happening in these collaboratives that allows for that dialogue with communities that are affected by this work? And if there's...
So was that to Doug or to all of us?
Whomever, yeah. Whoever
Charlotte, do you want to?
I guess I'll try to pick up that last question, Doug, but what I was going to add on the earlier question as well is just to add another strand to the example that I just gave around the California truck rule. A significant portion of that coalition that worked on that rule comprised frontline community groups who were representing people across the state who especially suffer from diesel truck pollution. Often those trucks are operating in corridors through lower income neighborhoods. You have much higher incidence of asthma and so forth in those neighborhoods. And those are very persuasive and important voices when a broader group of advocates is pressing the state to take aggressive action. So that's one example. And I don't know for sure, but I have no doubt. I don't know for sure what the mechanisms were, but I know that the funders that were supporting that coalition were in dialogue constantly with those grantees. So I think there's some automatic feedback loops built in just in the way that we all work with great grantees.
Great. Another question from the audience, or Jen, did you want to jump in on this as well?
I guess I just wanted to add, and let me know if there's too much feedback on my end. I just wanted to add, I think the climate community would tell you that they haven't gotten this right over time, that this is actually new learning for them, and that we can't win without the voices of those who are most affected being at the table, not only because they can explain how it's impacting them, whether in the global south or in disenfranchised communities in the United States, but also because they have innovative ideas for what the solutions are. So if you have a climate mitigation strategy that doesn't have an equity lens to it, you will fail. So it's really important to know that. And that is actually new thinking for the climate funding community, I would say. The Global Philanthropy Forum and the Climate Leadership Initiative co-hosted a whole webinar on that, and we can maybe put that in the chat so people can see it.
I think that's an extraordinary point, Jen. Without that feedback loop, without the consideration of the communities, we will fail, right? And we need to think about equity at the forefront of this. Another question that came in from the audience here: do you have best practices for supporting evidence-based climate action? And again, would love to take volunteers on who wants to triage this one. Is there anyone that wants to start?
Evidence-based is Charlotte.
Exactly.
So there are lots of thoughts in response to that question, but I would say that the core of what we're doing in the climate funding community is sharing evaluations. There are quite a few foundations that will rigorously conduct often third-party evaluations of strategies, of efforts, of sometimes of individual grantees. And in appropriate ways. I think we've gotten quite good as a community at sharing those evaluations so we can learn from them. There is a lot of learning that goes on in the climate funding community. There's more needed, but we have a pretty good body of evidence so far that helps us think about what works and what doesn't. And we need to do more of that, frankly.
And I think, for us, the ClimateWorks, information database, et cetera, that's our first go-to. And that's like a huge, there was an earlier comment on the infrastructure of, the climate infrastructure that's been built up that Jennifer said people can jump into. Even for us who have been working on this issue for a long time, we really depend on that information because, we don't want to invest our own resources in being the knowledge holders, right? The knowledge holders need to be our grantees. They need to be our intermediaries and our collaborative partnerships that have the expertise and can drive it out to the field as necessary.
So Doug, let's stay with you for a moment here. Let's talk about the issue of impact, right? An oft talked about issue. How does the Oak Foundation measure success with its work with collaboratives in climate?
So probably should caveat this a few times. If you have Charlotte was talking, if you have kind of a line of the foundations that are most data-driven and impact measuring and monitoring, evaluation and learning fiends, we would be on the other side. We claim the success of our grantees, and that's what we really look at is, do they have the structures in place to capture the learnings? Are they monitoring themselves effectively? We do look at evaluations, but we also we try to be flexible and supportive donors. We try to be core support donors or flexible project support if it's an area. We do learning differences, dyslexia, and education. So we often don't do a core fund, but we say, but within the dyslexia space, have at it. And so we try to do the same thing with our collaboratives and try not to be overly prescriptive and try to accept whatever measurements for success they have. And so, we would love to be able to have in all of our collaboratives, okay, we prevented 180 coal-fired plants to be constructed in Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in all of them. Are we aiming for a 10% reduction in meat consumption in Europe in the next 5 years? Okay. But I think we're not the best to speak about that. But it is one of those moments that I think if you're going to jump into the collaborative, it's important to be clear with yourself what the success is and that the collaborative has established that. But we generally will try not to define that for others. We hope that will come organically from the collaborative and along with that have their monitoring, evaluation, and learning things in place.
I think two great points that I would echo that I would underscore here. The first is think about success for yourself and then think about how the collaborative defines success. I think those are both brilliant points. On the latter point, Charlotte, I'd love to bring you in and share how ClimateWorks thinks about this notion of success and how ultimately you define that for your community.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, the climate community and ClimateWorks as well is big on quantification, big on measurement. And there are lots of ways to measure impact. So for example, from a big picture scientific perspective, you want to look at metrics like annual global greenhouse gas emissions, accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, change in global average temperature rise compared to pre-industrial levels. Those are the big indicators that tell us whether or not we're getting on track to meet climate goals and give us a sense of the likely impacts we're facing. There are other ways to measure impact. So for example, and this is very important, as Doug said, in collaborations, if you pick a specific goal, specific strategy, then you want to measure relevant indicators, like the example Doug gave of 180 coal plants that were prevented from being built in Southeast Asia. How quickly are sales of electric vehicles growing? How quickly are we installing new capacity of solar and wind? What's the year-on-year increase in private capital that's directed to climate solutions? Those kinds of indicators. Those are more market indicators. You can also measure policy outcomes, like how many governments or corporations have signed up for net zero targets or committed to procure low emissions, low carbon materials. We look at all of those kinds of metrics, but when it comes to success, Nick, I just want to share a quote that I thought was really important and really struck me. This is from a June New York Times article titled "Black Environmentalists Talk About Climate and Anti-Racism." It's a quote from Heather McGee, who's a senior fellow at Demos, and she said, "Success is measured by the improvement in the environmental and economic health of the people who have borne the brunt of our carbon economy." And I thought that was really a powerful way to measure success, and one that we should be constantly mindful of in doing our work.
I think that's a brilliant way to end our program. We've got about 4 minutes left. I would love to do a bit of a last round with each of you. As we come to a close and we issue a bit of a call to action, what advice would you give to the audience? How might the people listening move towards action? What resources are available? What would you ask of everyone that is listening here? And we didn't talk about this beforehand, but Doug, why don't I start with you?
Okay, well, I'm going to take the easy way out. I would say learn from Charlotte, listen to Jennifer, and join us. How's that for a cheesy answer? Look, I mean, there's just so much need, and there are so many amazing ideas out there. We recently at the Oak Foundation and our environment team is had a strategy day, and we're going to try to fund 8 campaigns with $1 million of grassroots organizations. And so we had all of our program officers and the whole staff present ideas. And I went to every idea and said, "Oh my God, we got to do that." And there were things that I just had never thought about that are just incredibly important, and people are doing amazing work. And so I would learn from Charlotte and listen to Jennifer and just dive in and do your best.
Great. Wonderful advice. Let's move to Charlotte.
Love that question. Thank you for asking that. We absolutely need more funders and funding in this space. There is a lot more to do, and there are just really great groups and campaigns and strategies all around the world to fund. When it comes to resources, there are lots of resources out there. You could read publications like Drawdown or Exponential Roadmap. Others, you could do a whole range of experts. You could join a funder collaborative on a topic of interest. We've cataloged more than 70 of these now that are focused on climate mitigation topics alone. But the main point I would like to make is that one of the challenges of funding in the climate space, and Jen referenced this earlier, is that it can just feel overwhelming. It is complex. There are a lot of resources out there, and it can be hard to pull this together and assess where and how to invest. And that is true even for very experienced climate funders. And that's why foundations like Oak and others support organizations like mine, like Jen's, that can help. So for example, with the support of Oak and others, we make our services freely available to funders who are interested in the landscape of solutions and opportunities and where funding is going and how to engage with the wider climate philanthropy ecosystem. We design our programs to make it easy for funders to support high impact strategies and move money quickly to great groups on the ground and work with others for maximum impact. So all this to say, if you have questions, if you're interested in expanding your climate philanthropy or whatever you have in mind, please don't hesitate to contact ClimateWorks. You can contact me directly or just make use of the resources available on our website. We are here to help.
Great. I'm sure people will absolutely reach out. And Jen, closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So two main things. One, it is actually harder to solve climate change than it is to fund effectively. So don't be worried. The funding part is the easy part. As Charlotte and Doug both said, and as you've heard in the examples, there are lots of great scalable things that are they're just starved for resources because so many people thought governments would solve this problem and they haven't. And there are really interesting, unique leverage points for philanthropy. We just have to scale the funding. The second point is you don't have to define yourself as a climate funder or even an environmental funder to enter this space. If you are a philanthropist or an organization thinking about this and you don't want to staff up and you don't want to make this your mission, just make it part of your portfolio, because what we know for sure is that whatever you care about most for your philanthropy is going to be impacted by this issue. And so getting upstream of that and giving some funding to it would help those of us who are working on it directly to make the impacts we need to on the very short time frames we have. So come on in.
It's a perfect note to end on. I want to thank each of you for your wise wisdom and your time. And to all of you that are listening, I hope that you'll embrace the spirit of collaboration and join forces with your peers to act now. This is an urgent need and the moment is now. So thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Nick.
And before we close, just a brief announcement. We hope that everyone will join the closing session when Indigenous Wisdom Shapes National Policy with Juan Manuel Santos, former president of Colombia, which starts in a few minutes at 12:25 Pacific time. And again, thank you all for listening, and thank you to the panelists. You're all doing extraordinary things, and thank you, GPF.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Bye.